Look at this strip of land in the Sahel. A few years ago, it was bare sand and cracked dirt, the kind of ground where nothing holds. Today, it is green. Trees, shrubs, millet growing in the shade, a well that still has water. And here is the strange part. Almost none of it came from the plan the world paid for. Africa pledged nearly $19 billion to build a wall of trees across the Sahel, a green barrier to hold back the Sahara. What actually grew was something nobody drew on the map. Rewind to 2007. The Sahara was pushing south. Across the Sahel, that dry belt of land that runs along the southern edge of the desert, farmland was turning to dust. Wells were drying. Soil that once grew millet and sorghum was blowing away in the wind. Families were walking away from villages their grandparents had built, because you cannot farm sand. The desert was not a wall coming toward them. It was the ground under their feet dying. So the African Union approved an idea so bold it sounded like science fiction. Plant a wall of trees, not a fence, not a barrier of concrete. A living forest, a green line stretching across the entire continent, from Senegal on the Atlantic coast all the way to Djibouti on the Red Sea. A wall of roots and leaves that would hold the soil, trap the moisture, and stop the Sahara cold. The numbers were enormous. The planned line ran nearly 5,000 miles, roughly 8,000 kilometers through 11 countries of the Sahel, and the price tag climbed into the billions. $19 billion, 5,000 miles, 11 nations. And what actually grew was not the plan. Here's the dream they sold the world: a green wall you could see from space. Picture a satellite image of Africa, a tan continent with a dark green band cutting straight across it, a forest so wide and so long that it shows up from orbit. It was simple, it was beautiful, and most of all, it was easy to fund. Governments love a line on a map, something clean you can point to. Donors love a photograph of a child pressing a sapling into the ground. The Great Green Wall had both. It became one of the most celebrated environmental projects on Earth, backed by the United Nations, by the African Union, by film festivals and pop stars. And the ambition behind the line was genuinely staggering. The plan was not just to slow the Sahara. It was to restore 100 million hectares of degraded land across the Sahel by 2030, to create 10 million jobs in some of the poorest rural regions in the world, and to pull 250 million tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. On paper, it was a climate fix, a jobs program, and a humanitarian rescue all bundled into one green line. That is why the world said yes so fast. The promise was that big. The problem is that the promise was built on an image, and the image was wrong. So the planting began across the Sahel. Crews arrived in Senegal, in Niger, in Mali, in Burkina Faso. They dug holes in straight lines across the dry ground. They dropped in seedlings by the million, watered them once, and moved on down the line. The map said a wall would rise here. Everyone waited for the green band to appear. It did not rise, it died. In the early years of planting, 80% or more of the trees died. 8 out of every 10 seedlings, dead within months of going into the ground. In one zone in Ethiopia, researchers came back and found fewer than 3 in 10 saplings had survived. And the reasons were not mysterious. They were almost embarrassing. There was not enough water in the driest years to keep a young tree alive. The species were often wrong. Trees chosen on paper that did not belong in that brutal soil. Nobody stayed behind to tend them or protect them from grazing animals. And worst of all, huge stretches of that 5,000-mile line ran through empty land, places with no farmers, no villages, no one with any reason at all to keep a seedling alive. Now think about what that means for the money. You truck or fly seedlings out to a remote patch of the Sahel. You pay crews to dig and plant them in a straight line through the sand. And within 2 months, most of them are dead sticks baking in the sun. That is not a forest. That is a budget line item turning into firewood. Run the math the way an accountant would. If 8 of every 10 trees die, then for every $10 spent on planting, 8 of them buy you nothing but a dead twig in the ground. The cost per surviving tree quietly multiplies into something absurd because you are not paying for the trees that lived, you are paying for all the ones that died first. One scientist looking at the whole approach did not soften it. He called it a stupid way to restore land in the Sahel. The wall, the literal wall of planted trees, was not slowing the Sahara. In a lot of places, it was simply burning cash in the desert. And it was not just the planting that cost money. It was everything around it. Nurseries to grow the seedlings, trucks and fuel to move them across some of the poorest, most remote terrain on the continent. Surveys, coordination across 11 separate governments, conferences, consultants, reports. A project drawn at the scale of a continent carries continent-sized overhead. So even before a single tree went into the ground, the Great Green Wall was an expensive machine. And that machine kept running whether the trees lived or not, and yet the funding kept climbing. This is the part that makes the money story so strange. At the One Planet Summit in January of 2021, world leaders stood up and pledged $14.3 billion to accelerate the Great Green Wall, and that figure did not stop there. Within 2 years, the commitments climbed past $19 billion, money lined up from development banks and national governments across the planet. By recent reporting, around 80% of that $19 billion had been programmed into projects across the 11 Sahel countries. So hold the full picture in your head. $19 billion committed to a wall of trees, and a wall that, in its original form, mostly would not grow. This is where the story turns. Because that failure, all those dead seedlings and all that spent money, forced a question that nobody running the project wanted to ask out loud. What if the wall was never the right idea at all? What if the thing they had been selling, the clean green line across the map, was the mistake hiding in plain sight? Here is the reveal. The people running the Great Green Wall quietly stopped trying to build a wall. And they admit it now, openly. One senior official described the project as no longer a physical wall, but a mosaic of land use practices. Read that again and let it land. The initiative, whose entire name is the Great Green Wall, now says on the record that it is not a wall. The metaphor that made it so easy to fund was the exact same metaphor that made it fail. A straight line drawn by planners far away ignored the one thing that decides whether a tree lives: the people on the ground and the land right under them. So what replaced the wall? Instead of one continuous green line marching across the Sahel, the project shifted to a patchwork, a mosaic. Restore the land where people actually live and farm. Stop chasing the straight line through empty desert. Mix tree growing with water harvesting, with protected grazing, with farmland built to hold moisture instead of losing it. A mosaic of green and productive landscapes, each one shaped to its own corner of the Sahel instead of a single rigid line imposed from the outside. It is less photogenic. You cannot see a mosaic from space the way you can see a wall. But it had one advantage the wall never had. It could actually survive. And then came the part that, looking back, should have been obvious from the very beginning. In Niger, in Burkina Faso, farmers were already doing something that worked, and it cost almost nothing. They were not planting new trees in straight lines at all. They were bringing back the trees that were already there, hidden under their own feet. Across much of the Sahel, the roots of old cut trees still lived in the soil, an entire underground forest, dormant, waiting. The land looked dead on the surface, bare tan dirt to the horizon, but the roots were alive. Farmers learned to protect the green shoots that rose from those old roots, to prune them and care for them, and let them grow back into full trees right in the middle of their crop fields. They paired it with simple pits dug into the hardened ground to catch and hold the rain. The results were almost impossible to believe. In the Zinder Valley of Niger, when researchers measured it, they found 50 times more trees than there had been back in 1975. Not 50% more, 50 times, and almost none of it was planted. It regrew. Land that had been bare, dead dirt turned green again, and the green spread across millions of acres of Niger, putting shade and food and firewood back into the lives of millions of people. The deep mechanism, the exact thing these farmers changed that brought a forest back from the dead, is a story big enough to stand on its own, and it is the one we are telling next. For right now, just sit with the contrast. Billions of dollars, helicopters, imported saplings, straight rows planted by outsiders, mostly failed. Farmers protecting roots that were already in their own ground, almost for free. Mostly worked. The most expensive plan lost to the cheapest one. So where does the Great Green Wall actually stand today? Let us be honest about the scorecard, because the honest version is far more interesting than the brochure. The early completion numbers were grim. Around 2020, some counts put the wall at only 4% of its goal. Other measures said closer to 15%. The truth is that even the experts could not agree, partly because the project kept changing what it was even trying to count. More recent reporting is genuinely better. By the latest figures, roughly 30 million hectares of land have been restored across the Sahel, which puts the project somewhere near 30% of the way toward its target. That is real progress, and it is worth saying out loud after years of bad headlines. But the goal was never 30%. The goal is 100 million hectares of restored land by 2030, plus 10 million new jobs across these rural regions, plus 250 million tons of carbon pulled out of the sky. At the current pace, the Sahel will not reach that by 2030, and the money is not enough either. Experts now estimate the full vision needs something like $33 billion, far more than the $19 billion that has been pledged. The gap between the dream and the bank account is still wide. So did the Great Green Wall fail? That is the wrong question, and it is the question that keeps getting it wrong. The original idea, the literal wall of planted trees marching across the desert, mostly did fail, and a painful amount of money went into the sand learning that lesson. But the idea underneath it, the real one, that the Sahara can be pushed back and the Sahel can turn green again, is very much alive. It is just not wearing the costume it started in. It does not look like a wall you can see from space. It looks like a farmer in Niger walking out at dawn into a field that was dead 10 years ago and standing in the shade of a tree that planted itself. If this is the kind of story you come here for, the slow, true version instead of the headline, then subscribe and stay with us, because this channel lives in exactly this gap between the plan and what really happened. The next chapter is the one that flips everything you just heard. For nearly 30 years, almost every tree Niger tried to plant died in the ground, and then a handful of farmers changed one thing, one simple thing. And the trees came back by the millions, without anyone planting a single one. That is the next video, and we are going to show you exactly what they changed.